Welcome to our interview series on brave feminine leadership. I'm absolutely delighted today to be joined by Laura Liswood. Laura, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you, Melissa. I'm delighted to be here.
Laura, I am going to touch on your incredibly impressive bio firstly, so that people who haven't come across you before are aware of who I'm talking to. So excuse me a minute while I sort of look down and work my way through this. So Laura is the Secretary General of the Council of Women World Leaders and the former Managing Director and Senior Advisor at Goldman Sachs. In August 1996, Laura co-founded the Council of Women World Leaders with President Vigdis Finnbogadottir of Iceland, located at the UN Foundation in Washington, D.C. Laura is the Secretary General of the Council, which is composed of women presidents, prime ministers, and heads of government. It's the only organisation of its kind globally. From 2001 to 2016, Laura was also named Managing Director, Global Leadership and Diversity for Goldman Sachs, and later became a Senior Advisor, and continues to speak to audiences globally on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Laura has an MBA from Harvard Business School, a law degree from the University of California, and is admitted to practice law in California and Massachusetts. After the events of 9/11, I found this fascinating, Laura, she became a reserve police officer in the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department and retired as a sergeant. Laura is the author of 4 books: The Loudest Duck, Moving Beyond Diversity, The Elephant and the Mouse, Women World Leaders, and Serving Them Right. She's a long-time participant with the World Economic Forum and is a steward of the forum's Education, Gender and Work initiative. Laura, I could keep going on. There are so many achievements and fascinating aspects of your career. But again, thank you for joining us. And I might just ask for anyone in our audience who hasn't had the pleasure of coming across you before, can I get you to start explaining to us, who you are, and let's start focusing on you and your journey.
Well, the who you are question is always one it's a continual work in progress, isn't it, Melissa? Yeah, all of us are that. As I look back on my career, and that's the only way you can sort of make any sense of looking at yourself in the rearview mirror and saying, okay, were there some common themes? Why did you make these decisions? Because when you're in the moment, you're not necessarily conscious that you're on some sort of path. I like there's a wonderful book by Mary Catherine Bateson called Composing a Life. And she specifically references women who kind of build on their lives, they have a set of experiences, and then they move into another set. Unlike a lot of men who say, okay, I'm going to become the CEO, and this is how I'm going to get there. We kind of meander our way through, and then we end up where we end up with what appears to be, and for me, has been a set of very rich experiences. But they just kind of build on each other. So, and I'm an experiential learner, so I like to get my hands on things. For example, I did go around the world and I met at the time all the living women presidents and prime ministers, right? And because I wanted to know what it'd be like to have a woman president in the United States. That was my question. Yes. You've at least solved it somewhat in Australia with your prime minister, Julia Gillard. That was, when I think about that, I probably should have started with small town mayors, interviewing them, and then moving on to heads of state and government. No, I just said, okay, I'm going to do that. Yeah. So it's as I say, it's a continual work in progress. I'm never quite sure what the next thing is going to be, but it does build on itself. There is some logic to it. And then, we all then begin to say, okay, well, I have this set of experiences. Maybe I can use these set of experiences. An example for me might be, so yes, I did become a police officer after 9/11. It was a really important and eventful kind of thing for me. And I've seen both the extraordinariness of being a police officer and some of the tragedy that we have seen in some police activity and actions. But now, for example, I'm on a board that looks at one of the police agencies in this region of the DC region, and it combines my police experience with my diversity and inclusion experience, because we look at issues around use of force or racial discrimination issues and things like that. And so I can I can kind of straddle both sides with that. And that, that gives me, that's very satisfying to be able to take both sets of experiences with me.
Well, let's go back to your sort of upbringing and values and how they shaped you. I'm keen to understand how you sort of ended up in the diversity inclusion space. So what appears to be so early in your career, maybe it's not, but I'll open up that question for you.
Well, it wasn't quite initially too early. I mean, I come from a family that was relatively blue collar. What is interesting is my father was a police officer. So, that sense of familiarity with being a police officer was always there for me. But basically blue collared. Neither my parents had high school or college degrees. But they very much encouraged myself and my brother and my sister to get educated. We had, I remember one high school guidance counselor coming to our home and seeing this wall of books that she didn't normally see in kind of blue collar houses. And so that was, an important part of our upbringing. And so education was always a part of that. And I'd gotten involved in politics when I was younger in California. And so I went into got a political science degree, and then still not knowing what I was going to do, I figured that, well, most politicians or people around politics had a law degree. So, okay, I'll go and apply and get a law degree. Well, being a lawyer, I often liken it, you go into law school as chuck steak and you come out as hamburger meat. And you're not quite sure that that's what you want it to be. Now, I will never, deny that my law background has been very useful for me, and I practiced law for a short period of time, but I did it in the sort of gender discrimination world, so that was part of that. And then I really decided, well, maybe I didn't want to be a lawyer, and so maybe I should think about business. And so I decided, well, I would apply to one business school. And if I didn't get into that business school, I wouldn't go. And I wanted it to be outside of California because I'd been educated in California. So I applied to the, as they call it, the well-known Eastern Business School in Boston, in Cambridge. And so I did get into the Harvard Business School. And so then I went to the business school, which was an interesting experience in and of itself, because when I was there, most of the men had a sense of the divine right to rule. There, which was interesting. But it turns out the combination of the business degree and the law degree were very useful for me. So that allowed me to go into business, and that's how I started. Well, first and foremost, I had to get a very high paying job to pay off the school loans that I'd had for doing all that education. So that's kind of what launched me into all of this. And it's been an interesting credentializing for me. And as you know, women have to be credentialized quite a bit. And so the education has held me in good stead. And of course, I've met some extraordinary people along the way.
So if we then think about sort of navigating your career, so you're very well credentialed, you're now in the world of business. What was it like navigating your career at that point in time? Did you move quickly through the organization? How did that kind of work?
I would have to say I stumbled initially, and that turns out to be an okay thing to do. The first job I took was with a consulting company, and I was completely out of my depth. Here I was, never having had any business experience, and I'm supposed to tell CEOs what they're supposed to do. It made no sense whatsoever. Yeah. It made no sense to me. So that was, but it was the highest paying job, and it was definitely the silver object to go after. But I realized that it was just not me. But I did end up then working for a company, TWA at the time, where I got an operational job. And for that, I do say to women, get those kinds of operational experiences, get those P&L responsibilities, right? And so I did that, and I did that for a number of years with them. I ran a charter operation for them. I ran some airports and sales offices, et cetera. And that was a fundamentally great experience for me. And that's where I got a lot of the ideas around service quality, because there's so many metrics in an airline that you have to meet just by safety standards. right, that it really held me in good stead. So often I will tell women, start off if you can with that solid, P&L responsibility. Then you can do something else if you want. So that was very useful for me. And then again, I've ended up in a sort of a career that's, I then got onto this idea of meeting the heads of state. And, that was sort of a project. Well, so I ended up consulting so I could still have money coming in and going around the world meeting these heads of state, which then put me into a whole different direction of, working with these leaders, creating a council of them, and becoming the Secretary General. But I still did keep my hand into the consulting world for a while. And, I was fortunate to be invited to come work for Goldman Sachs for a number of years, an excellent company for me, even though, I was voted most likely to fall asleep in my finance class at business school. So people often had a little bit of an arched eyebrow when I said I went to Goldman Sachs. But I went, with the responsibility of leadership and diversity.
That's fabulous.
So, it's just, you sort of, so for, it was interesting when I interviewed the heads of state, and almost all of them expressed that they were over scrutinized, that their communication, their dress, their hairstyles, you name it, you still hear it today, right? They were all over scrutinized. The tolerance for mistakes was less for women than the tolerance for mistakes for men. Nothing you haven't heard, right?
Absolutely.
And so they would, almost all of them said, if they did not have a passion for what they were doing, they would give up. And so when young women ask me about leadership, I often say, what is it you're passionate about? Because if you're passionate about something, you're likely to take on what you're calling that brave leadership.
Yes.
So that's how I look at it. Is you continue to hone yourself to understand what your passions are.
Laura, what was fascinating to just embark on this idea of interviewing all of these state leaders. What sat behind, it's obviously a deep curiosity, but what was the question you were trying to answer there?
It was one of these, I often joke and say it was one of these in the shower questions, you have them. You're in the shower, and generally speaking, most of those in the shower questions should stay in the shower, basically. But this one was, what would it be like if we had a woman president in the United States?
Yes.
Not so arbitrary, because I had read some research from the Center for American Women in Politics at Rutgers, and it was the first quantitative study I had ever read about how women legislated differently than men. These were state legislators. And as you know, there's a difference between quantitative analysis and anecdote. Mm-hmm. So this was that first one, that there was enough that they could do this analysis and say, okay, this is definitively what happens. And it showed that women state legislators introduced, Democrat or Republican in our country, introduced different bills. They interacted with their constituents differently. They handled committees differently. So that's what got me then to project that and say, well, if that were the case, what would happen if we had a woman president? What might change in the country? But of course, when I was doing this work, there was not, and there still is not, anyone in the United States to answer that question. We just haven't gotten it.
So we live in hope on that particular one, probably more than hope in that regard. But what did you find? So when you started having all of these conversations, what did you find?
Well, you find you come up with a variety of things. First and foremost, I will say that there were 15 women living at that moment who were then or had been president or prime minister of their country. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now I have to say, I have no idea why I thought I could meet a woman president or prime minister, right? I'm not from CNN.
Yes.
I've never asked anyone what kind of a tree they would be if they were a tree. So my interview skills weren't that good, but I will tell you, interestingly, this is going to sound pretty odd, but the year before I embarked on this project, I bicycled across Siberia. Now, don't do it. I did it, but don't do it. Okay. Now, your primary emotion when bicycling across Siberia, right, is fear.
Right.
You are fearful constantly. There's nobody out there. It's not like you had cell phone service. Yes, we had, support for it. But when you start bicycling in Siberia with the 24-hour sun, you're by yourself at that
I was
point.
going to add loneliness to that as well, but
Well, you could add loneliness, but pretty much fear was the. But one of the things that I discovered was that if I did not harness and control that fear, it would debilitate me. It would just de-energize me.
yes.
So what I decided to do was to say, okay, once a day, I'm taking this fear out of my backpack and I'm looking at it. And I'm going, yep, fearful, yep, and I'm putting it back. Right? So that was really a primary. So I sort of increase my tolerance for fear or something. Because you could say you could be kind of fearful asking for these appointments. Now, the other lesson of that is if I had never asked for the interviews, the answer is always no.
Laura, I feel like I'm talking to myself. I've got to work up towards the female presidents, but incredible. I so understand everything you're saying. So you asked.
I asked, yeah. And of the 15, not one of them turned me down for an interview. Margaret Thatcher did say, come back after you've met everyone else.
Okay. So you did.
Well, that was her way of getting rid of me. Yeah. But, true to her word, and because I am an experiential learner, I was eternally grateful I'd met 14 other prime ministers before I got to Margaret Thatcher.
Yes, I can imagine.
But, each one of them, what was fascinating was another lesson learned. My interviews were getting longer and longer and longer because each of them, because I'm the only person who's met them all, each of them wanted to know the answers that the others had given.
Yes.
Right? Because one of the things that happens to women, I think, if we don't have someone else who's been in a similar circumstance tell us, oh yeah, that's happening to me, right? For women, if we don't have that, we think there must be something wrong with us.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yes.
There's something wrong. And then we sort of make it pathological. Oh my God, there's something, I'm doing something terrible. But when you can talk to other women and they go, oh yeah, exact same thing happened to me, then you go, oh, okay, maybe it's not me, maybe it's society, maybe it's the culture, maybe it's the acceptance levels, it's whatever. Right? To remove that sort of, and that's what I think a lot of women, they potentially lose their confidence because they think, oh, what's wrong with me? What am I doing wrong? But in fact, they're not doing anything wrong. It's just how society is reacting to them.
When did the idea of a first book come about?
Well, the service quality book came about when I became, in the United States, what's called a Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Senior Examiner. And so that was a really in-depth look at both manufacturing and service companies and their quality. Zero error kind of thing. So I learned a lot and wrote this book, what started out to be 50 Ways to Lose Your Customer, and turned it into this service quality book. Then I brought camera crews with me. I picked up camera crews in countries, and that became then a PBS documentary. And then, the book arose out of the interviews themselves. And I will say, again, I didn't really have any ideas how to interview people, how to, use camera crews, anything like that. But what I did was I would ask people, I asked, a couple of Pulitzer Prize winning journalists, how do you do it? What are the best questions to ask? And people were so willing to help me. And so that's how you can build up your sense of how to do something like this.
Okay, so I circled back then to the 15 women that you have interviewed at this point in time. What then happened? Like, how did the idea come about to create the General Council?
Yeah, well, it actually became very straightforward for me because I was hearing so many of the same experiences from them. I finally just started asking them if they wanted to meet each other. Yeah. And see, that's what I'm saying. What happens, I couldn't have anticipated that, right? But you can just make this logical jump. Well, I'm hearing all these same things. What if they meet each other? And they said, yes, they would be interested. So I went back to Washington and collaborated with a think tank in Washington, D.C., where we created a summit in Stockholm for these world leaders. And most of them came. And I then did quite a bit of research on head of state organizations, what they look like and how they were composed and how they, all of that. And so then we had this meeting with these heads of state, and I proposed, and Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, chaired that meeting. And I proposed creating this council of these leaders. Again, I didn't anticipate any of this going, in the past. And they all agreed. They wanted a council. So Mary Robinson asked President Vigdis of Iceland, and you did a good job of pronouncing her name.
Thank you.
Yes. She asked President Vigdis and me to co-found the council, which we did. And so we initially put it at the Kennedy School. Dean Joe Nye invited us to come to the Kennedy School. And so what happens is we have a chair, and that rotates periodically. And she invites any newly elected, freely elected woman, head of state or head of government, to join.
And so for that reason, my understanding is President Vigdis was the first female democratically elected to president?
Correct.
Yes. Correct. Okay. So it's sort of symbolic that she was one of the founders.
Yeah. And Sarima Bandaranaike was the first woman prime minister to be elected from Sri Lanka. Okay. And so now our current chair, interestingly, is Katrin Jakobsdottir, who is the prime minister of Iceland again. So it's kind of come full circle in that regard. But we now have 86 members of the council. So there are 86. So almost all of the former and almost all of the sitting heads of state are members.
And hoping for fast growth.
Well, we do hope. The interesting thing is once you're a member, you stay a member. Yes. So the real question is, how many sittings do you have at any one time? And generally speaking, that's usually 10 to 15 sitting at any one time. Yeah. And that doesn't seem to go a heck of a lot more than that. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm dying to ask you, being surrounded by all of these leaders, in your opinion, are leaders born or made?
What is that phrase? Some people, are born to leadership. Some people achieve leadership, and some people have leadership thrust upon them. Right?
Yes.
We're seeing a classic example of that tragically in the Ukraine, where, this man, Zelensky, is having leadership thrust upon him.
Absolutely.
Right? And with the women leaders, about a third, a little less now, but about a third come to power after their husbands or fathers have been assassinated.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this will be in countries where you would least expect to see a president or a prime minister, right? The Pakistans of the world,
yes.
The Philippines of the world, or the Sri Lankas, or whatever, and everything. So that's the thrust upon, them. And what happens with them, and how successful are they? So I'm not sure I think if you say born, the problem with born is we have so many archetypes of what leaders look like, that if you happen to be, arbitrarily born where you're going to be ultimately tall, or you're going to ultimately be white, or you're going to ultimately be male, well, those are genetic, of course, but that's just because we have archetypes of what leaders look like, So the born part is a little iffy to me. The achieve part, I think, is more likely. How are leaders created? over time. And I personally think that for women, we all have leadership capacity within us. We all do,
Yes.
because if you look at the traits of good leaders, what are they? They're traits that are non-gendered, right? They have ideas. They have ability to communicate their ideas. They create a sense of trust, a sense of hope, right? They help others achieve their goals in life. Those are gender neutral traits. Those aren't just exclusively male traits. So the traits of good leaders, to me, fall either with male or female. Now, what society accepts or welcomes or approves of, different question. Different question. The best definition I've ever read, came from what Vivaldi said made the best composer. He said the best composer has a cool head and a hot heart. So that cool head, that practical, how are we going to get from A to B? But that hot heart, how can I get other people to charge up the hill with me? How can I get people to follow me with that? But unfortunately, we do have these archetypes which have a tendency. And what are archetypes? Archetypes mean that, for example, Malcolm Gladwell's book in Blank, where he talks about 16% of men in the United States are 6 feet or taller, which 184 centimeters, right? 16%. That's the grouping. But then when you look at Fortune 500 male CEOs, 57% of them. So that's 4 times the cohort, right? And yet, I don't know about you, Melissa, but I've yet to read any research that correlates leadership ability and skeletal structure.
Yes.
I've yet to read any research that correlates those two things.
Absolutely.
But we have an archetype, right? So you're 6 foot tall, you walk into the room, everyone goes, oh, leader, until you open your mouth and start talking. And then everyone goes, oh, maybe not leader, maybe not, But you're 5'9" or shorter, you walk into the room, nobody says leader until you prove it.
Yes.
That's the difference. That's how an archetype works. One gets it until they lose it. One doesn't have it until they prove it. 2 totally different things.
Wow. I want to ask you about, I recently saw you speak at an OECD conference, and it was to do with COVID recovery. And one of the things that, and I've got some of the words that you used in front of me here that I really want to explore with you. And it is touching on this sort of archetype, but it's talking about the fact that all leaders bring something different to the table, was the conversation that you were having. So it's getting into the diversity, but it was talking about different leadership traits. And one of the quotes you had was that women have the traits of leadership that we need today. Can I ask you to kind of just broaden out, what do you mean when you say that?
Okay, here's what I mean. The best leaders have the most tools in their toolbox, right? Okay. So there are times when you are a leader when it is useful and helpful to have a command and control style, right? So if the building is burning, you want the leader to say, go through door A now.
Yes.
Right? You don't want the leader to say, I'm thinking we might want to go through door A, but I want to hear what everybody else has to say about that.
Absolutely.
You don't want that. You want command and control. But command and control doesn't always work in other situations. In the situations where you want to hear differing ideas, differing perspectives, the diversity, the cognitive diversity that people bring, then you want people to be open to other ideas, to be listening, to have the empathy that goes along, to have that inclusion kinds of traits, right? The collaboration traits. So you want someone to say, well, let's discuss A. What do you think about it? What about B? So you want that kind of inquiring curiosity, and bringing in collaboration, cooperation, etc. So my point being is that women have a tendency, because of their non-dominant style, right? Because they've been historically underrepresented. They have developed a different style of leadership than those who have been historically overrepresented in leadership. Okay? And what I'm just saying is that we need to raise the value of that which the non-dominant groups bring to leadership and appreciate the value that dominant groups bring, but not say that's the major thing. That's the fundamental way we need to approach things. We need to look at it and say, what approach is better for the set of circumstances? You know, and that's where my, the book of The Elephant and the Mouse came about.
Exactly what I was going to ask you, because it really moves straight into that right now. And that book could not have landed at a better time for me in terms of my exploration of all of this. So help us understand, what's the purpose, I guess, of that book? What is that book saying? What message do you hope people step away from it with?
Well, there's several messages. The first and foremost one is that for people to understand, get into the elephant and mouse theory, but the precursor to that is to understand why some of the diversity has been so slow. Why we are confusing intention with impact or effort with outcome. Right? Because what happens is, and this is what this notion of the illusion of inclusion is, and that's Cheryl Kaiser's work, the illusion of inclusion, which is we do all of these programs. We have all the stuff we're doing with diversity, and companies will just give you a laundry list of things they're doing, and they'll be in the annual report, right? Mm-hmm. So what happens psychologically is we think, well, we're doing all of these programs, therefore we must be a fair organization.
Yes.
By the very fact we're doing all these programs. Mm-hmm. Not quite measuring or understanding is all of that effort creating the outcome. So that's one issue that I think is causing this slowness. The other issue is what I say is a myth of meritocracy, mm-hmm. right? That, as I often say, I've never met anyone who got to the top of an organization who said, I got to the top of this organization because I was subtly advantaged.
Yes.
Nobody says that, right? They say, I got to the top because this is a meritocracy and only the best get to the top.
Yes.
Little understanding, and this is the elephant, little understanding the lived experiences of many other people within the organization. Little understanding that there's subtle gatekeepers keeping some people from getting up there, right? Mm-hmm. But not knowing what those gatekeepers are, because particularly elephant dominant groups have a tendency to believe, well, the rest of the world works just the way it works for me.
Yes.
Not really understanding that the world does not work that way for other people, particularly non-dominants, the mouse, if you will.
Yes.
And one of the principles behind this is that organization leaders need to move from this elephant way of being, which is, I don't know, I know a lot about me, but I don't know much about the mouse group, right? The non-dominant groups.
Yes.
Whereas the non-dominant groups must know everything about the dominant groups. Dominant groups don't know much about non-dominants, but non-dominants know everything about dominance, right? Mm-hmm. And so what I'm saying is that dominant groups now, if you're going to have diversity, you better start understanding the lived experiences of the people within your organization. You better understand that women don't get as much good feedback. You better understand that minority groups within the organization aren't getting the critical assignments. Mm-hmm. You better understand that the LGBTQ groups don't feel that they can bring their whole self to the organization. You need to understand and do what I call a meritocracy stress test on yourself and say, hey, I think this is a meritocracy. Does everyone else? And if the answer is no, you better figure out why.
Yes. You and I could talk for hours on this book, and I know we don't have hours to talk on this book, so I'm going to try and throw a few things in quickly. I'd love your opinion. I still hear a lot from males and females that I don't believe in quotas. Can I ask your perspective on quotas?
Sure. I'm actually, and perhaps the older I get, the more I am in favor of affirmative mechanisms.
Yes.
Um, because it is proven, not that they should be permanently embedded, but that you do need some circuit breakers. Right? And I feel affirmative mechanisms are circuit breakers. Yeah. And so I'm actually in favor. And I'm in favor of doing the kind of research that occurs. So, for example, in Norway, where people often say, "Oh, I don't want to be seen as a quota woman," kind of thing.
Yes.
Well, the quota there is 40% of either gender. All right, the minimum of 40% of either gender. But because it means 40, because there's so few women, it meant 40% women. Well, when you get to critical mass at 40% like that, that whole quota thing goes away. And then you do the research and say, oh, it turns out the women, are slightly better educated than the men. They may have 1 or 2 years less corporate experience, but not demonstrably big. So you get this research that defies all this sort of, oh my God, the world is going to come apart here. Our company is just going to implode because we're doing this. Well, it turns out that no, there's a lot of very qualified women who can do this kind of thing. And then what I found most fascinating about Norway, the experience, is the research behind what's happened now that there's a critical mass of O's in a room full of X's, right? What's happened? What did they find? They found, for example, that women, is 40% women read the board materials. So now the men are coming to the board having read the board materials.
Yes.
So the very presence of the non-dominant group improves the performance of the dominant group, right? More of the board decisions are being made within the boardroom, not nightclub, golf course, country club. So in-group favoritism and closed social networks disappear.
Yes.
Yeah.
The seed and the soil.
Yeah.
Tell me about what the seed needs to do and what the soil needs to do.
Well, right. The seed and soil, I came up with that because I often heard from organizations, well, it's the individual's responsibility to make sure that their career goes well.
Yes.
Yeah. But then I would often hear from individuals, it's my manager's responsibility to make sure everything goes well. Well, the answer in my mind is both.
Both.
The seed has a 50% responsibility to make sure their career is going well, right? Because who cares most about your career besides your mother? You, right? But the soil has a 50%, as the institution, has a 50% responsibility to make sure the playing field is level, to make sure that some people aren't getting overheard and some people getting underheard, to make sure that, some assignments, the better assignments are going to this group and not, making sure that everyone in the meeting gets an opportunity to speak. Yeah. Now, I will say to the person who doesn't like to speak in meetings for whatever reason, because grandma taught them not to speak in meetings, you got to get a little out of your comfort zone and tell grandma to go home and start speaking up. But you, manager, have to call on this person also.
Yes. I loved that part of your book around the reference to grandma in terms of we all grow up with those things that we've learned along the way in terms of the way things work, which to me links directly to you cycling across Siberia, getting fear out of your backpack every day. Yeah, to kind of hit up against that. Can I just ask, we often talk about women coming up against double binds all the time. Did you come up across any in your career in terms of being assertive, so you're too hard or too soft or any of those?
I have. I think we all go through that tightrope bias kind of thing. I've generally, I think, been able to, as you know, I often use humor in my books and in my presentations. So I find that that's often helpful. And you don't always know what people are actually thinking about you as they hear it. But for me, I like to make sure that I have some impact. That I get that I'm heard. Yeah. And so, I guess I'm at this point, maybe at this point in my age, I don't care. I really don't. If somebody thinks I'm too this or too that, or not enough this or not enough that, that's, because incidentally, if someone says to you, well, Melissa, you are just too aggressive, right? You know what they're saying, of course, is you're just too aggressive for me. I don't like what you're doing. I don't. But that has nothing to do with you, Melissa. You may be perfectly appropriate for the situation. But if someone reacts, and that's what I've come to, it's like, hey, that's kind of your problem, not mine.
I want everyone listening to just stop and absorb that for a minute, because that is absolutely critical. If you had one, we're both passionate about seeing women elevated into leadership positions, or non-dominant groups elevated into leadership positions. If you had one thing that you thought could achieve that above all else, is there one thing that stands out as a lever that could be pulled? Or
I think obviously there's a number of things that help leadership. First and foremost, if you ask the military what makes for great leaders, they'll say practice. They'll say practice. Practice your leadership. Get a lot of feedback on what you're doing and keep practicing. And so for women, I like people to stretch themselves and to have the sense and to throw away all of this nonsense about women don't have confidence. It's just not true. One of the things we probably should be dealing with is overconfidence for men, not underconfidence for women. Yes. Kind of thing. So I want women to just have this sense that they're entitled to be leaders. They're entitled to be as heroic as men leaders, and they're entitled to be as mediocre as men leaders. But they're entitled to it.
Fantastic. I'm going to ask the final question I ask of everybody. And I'm so sad that it's the final question because I do want to keep talking. But Laura, from your perspective, what does brave feminine leadership mean? And do you think it needs to change?
I don't think it particularly needs to change per se. I think we all just need to identify, again, what our passion is, what makes me brave, and surround myself with people who support my braveness. Have a lot of wing persons, as I call them, who will help you with that. I just think we need to understand, given all the challenges that we have in the world, how crucial it is to have brave women leaders. Just like it's crucial to have brave men leaders, but we need just as many brave women leaders because we need to create change, because the best leaders create change, right? And change goes from the unthinkable to the impossible to the inevitable. But you need brave leaders who will move it to that inevitable.
Laura, thank you so much for adding your voice to the conversation. And I know that the reflection of you saying, if you'd never asked those world leaders, if you'd never approached them for those conversations, they would never have happened. And if you hadn't done that, the Council of Women World Leaders wouldn't exist. And to me, that just underpins, as you said, the bravery associated with, what for you was a thought in the shower. So it sounds like a pretty good thought in the shower. So perhaps you should get yours out of there more often. But wonderful to have you as part of our conversation. And I really encourage people to dive in and do some research on you and get access to your books, because they are full of just incredible insights and wisdom. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Melissa, for hosting me. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.